Hey guys, tonight we're getting a little muddy. So dim the lights, grab your tea, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket that doesn't smell like despair, and let's quietly descend into the gray, rain-soaked world of World War I trenches. Because, when people said, it'll be over by Christmas, they clearly meant Christmas 4 years later, after a few million funerals and at least one extremely traumatized generation. So tonight, we'll stroll, slowly, through the daily life of the average soldier during the First World War. We'll look at how they ate, slept, wrote letters home, avoided rats the size of cats, and occasionally tried not to dissolve emotionally under constant artillery. Don't worry, we're keeping things calm. Nothing loud, nothing heroic, just quiet misery, delivered softly. Let's begin. Imagine it's late 1914. You're 20 years old. Your country has told you that you're about to embark on the great adventure. Posters said you'd be home by the holidays, probably with a few medals, maybe even a story to tell. You believed them, because why wouldn't you? The last big war your country fought probably involved horses and fancy uniforms. But when you finally reach the front, you realize the adventure smells like rotting mud, gunpowder, and wet wool. The front is just an endless zigzag of trenches carved into the earth, a muddy scar stretching across Europe from the North Sea to Switzerland. And it's raining. It's always raining. You're standing ankle-deep in cold water, trying not to slip on what might be mud or might not. You don't ask. You just keep standing. That's your main activity now. Standing and waiting for something terrible to happen. The trenches were functional, in the same way that a ditch outside a pig farm
is functional. They were usually about 2 meters deep and a meter wide, lined with sandbags and bits of wood to stop the walls from collapsing. Of course, they collapsed anyway because nature didn't care about sandbags. There was a frontline trench where all the fun happened. Snipers, machine guns, random shelling, and the occasional gas attack to spice up the day. Behind that was the support trench, where men rotated to rest, which basically meant getting slightly less wet. And farther back still was the reserve trench, the 5-star spa of trench life, where you might even find a wooden plank to sit on and pretend it's civilization. Between your trench and the enemy's was a charming little patch called No Man's Land, which, of course, nobody wanted to be in, because if you went there, you became part of the scenery. Let's talk about mornings. The sun rises, though you can't see it through the fog and the smoke. Someone yells, "Stand to." That's the traditional dawn routine because attacks often came at sunrise. So you grab your rifle, climb up to the firing step, and stare into the gray mist, trying to spot movement on the other side. Usually there isn't any, so you stand there anyway, pretending to look heroic, while your boots fill with water and your fingers go numb. After that, if you're lucky, it's breakfast. Breakfast could be tea, if there's time and no one's shelling you, or it could be cold canned beef, biscuits hard enough to chip a tooth, and maybe some jam if supply lines hadn't collapsed that week. Some armies had trench kitchens, basically a guy with a small fire trying not to get blown up while boiling something that technically counts
as soup. And when you finally got your tin of food, you didn't think too hard about where the water came from. Spoiler, it came from puddles. You drank it anyway. Hydration is important. Of course, hygiene was a kind of ongoing tragicomedy. You'd think that in war, soldiers would be too busy fighting to care about cleanliness, and you'd be right. But when you're living in a hole with 50 other men, surrounded by rats, mud, and rotting everything, things escalate. Trench foot was a big one. The name sounds kind of cute, like something you might pick up from over-enthusiastic hiking. It wasn't. It happened when your feet stayed wet and cold for too long. The skin literally began to rot. Officers told men to change socks daily and rub their feet with whale oil, because that's apparently the only oil available when your civilization is collapsing. Then there were lice. Oh, the lice. They lived in your seams, in your hair, in your blankets, the constant companions of everyone from privates to generals. Soldiers nicknamed them chats, because soldiers cope with horror by giving it a pet name. They'd boil their shirts to kill them, which worked about as well as you'd expect. The lice just shrugged, waited, and came back. Eternal, invincible, loyal to no flag. And then there were the rats. Huge, fearless, immortal creatures that thrived in the trenches. They fed on leftover food, and sometimes on things that weren't food. Soldiers swore that some rats were as big as small dogs. They probably weren't that big, but when you're half-starved, half-delirious, and watching them scurry across sleeping men, it sure feels like they are. Men shot at them for sport, set traps, even trained dogs and cats to hunt them. The rats always won. You'd think morale would collapse entirely, but somehow people adapted. Humans can get used to almost anything, even the constant thud of artillery, or the smell of death wafting gently down the wind. So they wrote letters home. They made jokes. They carved little decorations into the trench walls. Someone might sing, quietly, to drown out the guns. There were moments of strange peace, tiny pockets of calm between the chaos. Sometimes men from both sides would shout across no man's land, swapping insults or even songs. During the Christmas truce of 1914, they famously climbed out, met halfway, and played football. It was brief, awkward, and absolutely human. Afterward, they went back to shooting at each other, because, orders. Let's drift a bit into what soldiers thought about. When there wasn't anything to do, which was most of the time, you'd think they'd be constantly terrified, but fear becomes background noise. What really haunted them was boredom. Endless, grinding boredom. They passed the time writing letters, reading, cleaning weapons, pretending to sleep. They gambled, played cards, told stories that no one believed. And when the mail came, it was like oxygen. Letters from home, mothers, wives, girlfriends, sometimes all three, kept them tethered to a world that felt increasingly imaginary. The letters they wrote back were often cheerful lies. "I'm fine," they'd say. "Food's good. Weather's not bad." They'd never mention the stench, or the nightmares, or how Private Thompson disappeared yesterday and no one went looking because they already knew. Now, sometimes you were rotated off the front line. This was called rest, which was optimistic. You'd go a few miles back, where the mud was only moderately deadly, and you'd get to wash, maybe shave, maybe even see a building that wasn't collapsing. If you were very lucky, you might get a real meal, something with flavor. Maybe bread that didn't come with maggots as a side dish. And you'd sleep, proper sleep, without shells screaming overhead. But you always knew you'd go back. The war wasn't done, and neither were you. You just waited for the next rotation, when you'd return to the trenches that had already begun to feel disturbingly like home. And the officers? Well, they lived slightly better, of course. Someone had to maintain the illusion of hierarchy, even in a mud pit. They had dugouts with actual furniture, gramophones, maybe even curtains. Because nothing says leadership like lace curtains in a death trap. Still, most officers weren't much better off. They faced the same shell fire, the same lice, the same creeping madness. But they had one key advantage. They were slightly more likely to die cleanly, standing above the trench when giving an order. The soundscape of trench life was unforgettable. In the worst way, there was the constant distant thud of artillery, like a giant heartbeat, machine guns rattling, the occasional whoosh of gas shells, sometimes silence, eerie, fragile silence that felt wrong, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And the smell. That's something veterans said they could never forget. A mix of mud, sweat, gunpowder, rot, and something else. the unmistakable scent of decay. After a few weeks, no one noticed anymore. You stopped smelling it because your brain gave up. Let's float a little deeper into the psychology of it all. The human mind isn't designed for constant stress. So soldiers developed coping mechanisms that ranged from grim humor to total emotional shutdown. They made fun of everything. Officers, the weather, the food, even the enemy. Sarcasm became survival. If you could joke about it, maybe it wasn't killing you yet. And when that didn't work, there was always silence. Men would stare into space for hours, minds blank, eyes hollow. Shell shock, they called it. The gentle Edwardian term for what we now know as PTSD. Doctors didn't understand it, of course. Some thought the men were cowards. Others thought their nerves were literally shaken by explosions. Treatment often involved being yelled at or given electric shocks, because nothing says relax like a few volts to the face. But many just endured, quietly, because there was no choice. And yet, in this bleak gray world, humanity stubbornly persisted. Soldiers shared food, helped each other write letters, dug graves for friends with care and dignity. Some even decorated their trenches, hung photos, painted signs, grew tiny flower patches. They built little communities, absurdly domestic, right there in the mud. Because even in hell, humans try to make homes. And when night fell, the world went dark, literally and figuratively. You'd sit in your trench, maybe light a cigarette, listen to the distant guns, and think about home. Stars above, shells in the distance, and the quiet rustle of rats doing whatever rats do. Some nights were peaceful, others weren't. But either way, morning would come again, and the cycle would repeat. Let's pause here. Breathe, and stretch our metaphorical legs. In the next part, we'll drift further into the human side. The soldiers' humor, the letters, the music, the weird ways they made the trenches feel almost livable. Because somehow, through all the mud, noise, and decay, people kept being people. And that's kind of beautiful, in a very depressing way. Of Part 1. A Soldier's Life in the Trenches. Would you like me to continue with Part 2, keeping the same sleepy, snarky tone, moving into soldiers' personal stories, trench art, morale, and emotional collapse?
There you again. Still here? Good. If you can still smell the damp earth and hear the distant boom of artillery, congratulations, you're properly immersed now. So, last time, we trudged through the daily grind of trench life. The mud, the rats, the weirdly loyal lice population, the half-hearted soup, and the constant sense that the planet itself had given up trying. Tonight, we'll drift a little deeper into the quieter parts. What soldiers thought, felt, and did to stay sane in a place where sanity had clearly gone AWOL. Let's start with letters. Letters. The lifeline between two worlds, one made of mud and misery, and one that still had clean sheets and sunshine. Every soldier wrote them. It didn't matter how tough or tired or cynical they were, you always wrote home to someone. To your mother, who still called you by your childhood nickname. To your sweetheart, who promised she'd wait, and sometimes actually did. Or to the kind neighbor who sent cookies that arrived 6 weeks late, smelling faintly of damp canvas and regret. Mail call was sacred. When the post came, everything stopped. Shells could be falling, but men would still crowd around the corporal like kids at Christmas. And when you didn't get a letter, well, that stung worse than frostbite. Maybe the mail got lost. Maybe she forgot. Maybe she found someone who wasn't knee-deep in mud halfway across the world. You told yourself it was the postman's fault. It was easier that way. Of course, letters home were works of fiction. No one wrote, "Dear Mother, today the trench collapsed and Jenkins drowned in it, so we used his shovel to dig him out." No, you wrote, Everything's fine here, weather's good, we're all in good spirits. There was
Even censorship. Officers or clerks who read your letters before sending them off, just to make sure you weren't telling anyone the truth. Can't have the folks of home realizing what a disaster their glorious war actually was. So everyone lied politely. It was the only way to protect the ones who cared. Now, when you weren't writing letters, you were waiting. There's a special kind of boredom that only exists in war. The kind that hums quietly underneath fear. You'd think constant danger would make every second thrilling. It didn't. It just made everything slower. Men played cards, smoked endlessly, told bad jokes, and argued about who had the worst officer. Some drew, others carved. Trench art became a real thing. Shell casings turned into vases, bullet casings reshaped into rings. There's something weirdly poetic about turning instruments of death into something vaguely decorative. One British soldier even carved an entire chess set out of spent bullets, because nothing says existential crisis like playing chess with the literal leftovers of yesterday's battle. Entertainment was scarce, but creativity wasn't. Units sometimes put on shows, full performances with costumes, scripts, and questionable singing. Someone would grab a wig, someone else a broom handle for a cane, and voila, instant comedy. They sang old songs, wrote parodies, recited bad poetry, because laughter, even fake laughter, was a small rebellion against despair. A French soldier once wrote, "We laugh because otherwise we would cry." And really that summed up the entire war in one tired sentence. And then there was the smell. We've talked about it, but it deserves a moment of its own. Imagine a mixture of rotting mud, gasoline, unwashed bodies, and whatever used to be alive a few weeks ago. Add some cigarette smoke.
Congratulations, you've recreated the authentic Western front fragrance. You couldn't escape it. Your clothes were soaked in it, your hair, your food. Even the letters you sent home smelled faintly of it, a kind of trench perfume no one wanted. At night, the world became eerie. The guns didn't stop, but they changed tempo, slower, distant, like thunder far away. You could hear rats rustling, water dripping, someone coughing in the dark. The stars, when visible, were painfully bright, so beautiful it almost hurt. You'd look up and for a few seconds you'd forget the mud beneath your boots. Then a flare went up, lighting everything in ghostly white. And just like that, you were back in the nightmare. Let's float over to the officers for a bit, because their lives were strange little islands of half-comfort and guilt. They slept in dugouts, slightly nicer holes with a table, maybe a cot, maybe even a bottle of wine if someone smuggled it in. But their nerves were just as frayed. Being in charge meant pretending to know what you were doing. You had to look calm, even when the map made no sense and your orders contradicted themselves. Men looked at you for direction, which was unfortunate, because you had no idea what was happening either. A few officers tried to make life bearable, organizing soccer matches, ensuring fair rations, cracking jokes to keep morale up. Others were less endearing, the type who barked orders from behind, shouting up and over, like they weren't sending kids to their deaths. War reveals character, sometimes nobility, sometimes incompetence, often both at once. Let's not forget the medics, the true heroes, though no one at the time thought so. They worked in dressing stations near the trenches. Basically muddy tents with a few stretchers and a doctor who hadn't slept in 3 days. The smell of antiseptic thought a losing battle with everything else. If you got hit, the odds weren't great. Sometimes you were carried back by stretcher bearers, who were, by the way, the bravest people alive, unarmed, walking through shell fire just to drag others out. You might make it to the field hospital. You might not. And if you did, the anesthetic was often just a cigarette and a strong word. Yet somehow, amidst all that, the medics joked, patched, and comforted. Because someone had to. And then there was the weather.
Oh, the weather, the eternal, vengeful god of trench life. Winter brought frostbite and frozen rifles. Summer brought flies, stink, and the delightful sensation of sweat mixing with mud. Rain turned the trenches into swamps. Men sank knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep, in what soldiers politely called slush and impolitely called something else. In 1916, one British private wrote in his diary, "The trench is a kind of living thing now. It eats our boots, our tools, and sometimes our will to live." He wasn't wrong. Occasionally, though, nature was kind. A clear sunrise after a storm, a quiet night without shelling. Moments so small you might miss them, but they mattered. Men would pause, breathe, and feel, just for a second, like life might exist again after all this. Someone would whistle. Someone else would hum. It didn't last, but it was enough. Now, let's talk about dreams. Not the lofty kind, the literal ones. Soldiers dreamed constantly when they managed to sleep. About home, about food, about being clean again. Some dreamed of walking into their village and hearing church bells. Others dreamed of
Nothing. Just darkness. Because sometimes nothing felt better than remembering. And then there was the waiting before battle. That strange, stretched-out time when you knew something was coming, but not when. You cleaned your rifle 3 times, checked your gear, ate something tasteless. You pretended not to be terrified. Someone would make a bad joke. Someone else would light a cigarette. And then, silence. The kind of silence that presses on your ears, heavy and suffocating. Then the whistle blew, and the world changed again. But we're not charging over the top tonight. Not yet. This isn't a story about battles. It's about being human inside the machinery of destruction. So, instead of explosions, let's drift into the small human rituals that kept soldiers grounded. Polishing boots, shaving, even when there was no one to impress. Writing, "To be opened in the event of my death," on a folded piece of paper and tucking it in a pocket. Little acts of control in a world that had none. And when things got really bad, when the shelling didn't stop, when the rain wouldn't end, men sang. Softly, sometimes just humming. Old folk tunes, pub songs, the kind you don't forget because they're tied to something warmer than this. Music filled the air like a fragile shield, a reminder that beyond the mud and madness, there was still something worth remembering. All right, let's stop here for a moment. Exhale, stretch, maybe imagine yourself back in your clean, dry room, far away from the mud of 1915. In part 3, we'll drift into the psychological collapse of the trenches, the strange ways soldiers adapted, broke, healed, and somehow kept going. We'll meet the poets, the cynics, and the ones who never spoke again. Because war doesn't just break bodies, it reshapes minds, quietly, permanently, and sometimes beautifully.
So picture it again. It's late 1916 now, the year of the Somme, Verdun, and the general realization that the human race might have made an enormous mistake. The trenches are deeper, wider, more permanent. You've been here long enough that your uniform and the mud have fused into one entity. Your handwriting's changed. Your laugh sounds different. You flinch at birds because their wings remind you of shrapnel. And yet, life goes on. Sort of. The human brain has a remarkable ability to normalize anything. After months of constant shelling, most soldiers stopped reacting to explosions. You'd think it would get easier. It didn't. It just settled into your bones, a quiet, vibrating awareness that never turned off. Then came the tremors, the blank stares, the shaking hands that couldn't hold a cup of tea or a rifle or sometimes even reality. They called it shell shock, a gentle phrase, almost poetic, for what was essentially a complete collapse of the nervous system. Doctors, being very confident and very wrong, thought it was caused by pressure waves from nearby explosions. They said the brain had been physically jarred by the shock waves, which sounded scientific, but didn't explain why soldiers who'd never been near an explosion were suddenly unable to speak, walk, or remember their own names. The truth was simpler and sadder. You can only live in fear for so long before your mind politely checks out. Some men screamed for hours. Some forgot how to move. Some went blind, though their eyes were fine. Others just sat and stared, quietly detached, as if they'd already left. The army didn't know what to do with them. At first, they called them cowards, gave them electric shocks, ordered them back to the front, because, of course, best cure for trauma is more trauma. Still, a few doctors did understand. In little hospitals behind the lines, they tried something radical: listening, letting the men talk, letting them cry. A young physician named W.H.R. Rivers treated the poet Siegfried Sassoon, yes, that Sassoon, who'd written verses about mud, blood, and the ridiculousness of calling it glory. Rivers realized that these men weren't broken soldiers. They were just human beings who had seen too much, which honestly could describe an entire generation. Let's talk about those poets for a minute. Because when you can't scream, you write. Wilfred Owen, another soldier poet, wrote quietly devastating lines like, "What passing bells for these who die as cattle." That's a man who has seen things he can't unsee, trying to make them sound almost beautiful. Trench poetry wasn't about heroism. It was about absurdity, about the sound of rats in the walls, the mud that swallowed men whole, and the cruel comedy of surviving just long enough to envy the dead. These poems survived when so many men didn't, and they became the memory of the trenches long after the trenches were gone. Back on the front, though, most soldiers didn't write poetry. They joked instead. Dark humor was the cheapest form of therapy available. They gave everything nicknames. Lice were chats. Artillery shells were whiz-bangs. Death itself was Old Jerry, like some cranky neighbor you couldn't quite get rid of. A man would lose his boots in the mud and call it a promotion to bare feet. A rat would crawl over someone's face at night and they'd say, "At least he didn't ask for a light." When everything around you was insane, humor became the last sane thing left. And then there was superstition, because when rationality fails,
Luck takes over. Men carried charms, photos, coins, bits of shrapnel that had almost killed them. They'd swear by the one cigarette that always lit under fire, or the socks they'd worn since the first day. One soldier wrote in his diary, "I've stopped believing in God, but I still believe in my lucky spoon." Honestly, same energy. The weather never improved. The mud didn't dry. The rats didn't move out. But people adapted in strange, quiet ways. You learned to eat while shells fell nearby. You learned to sleep standing up. You learned to stop jumping every time someone yelled "incoming," because what was the point? Your body became mechanical. Your emotions filed neatly away for later, if later ever arrived. Every so often, though, something pierced through the numbness. A bird landing on the parapet. A letter from home that smelled faintly of perfume instead of mildew. The sound of church bells far behind the lines, faint but real. Those moments hurt because they reminded you that the world used to make sense, but they also saved you, just a little. Let's drift into another kind of survival, friendship, because the only way to stay human in an inhuman place was through the people beside you. Comradeship wasn't some grand patriotic ideal, it was practical empathy.
You shared your last cigarette. You held the guy next to you when he shook after a bombardment. You laughed when he told the same story for the 10th time because it kept him grounded. You didn't fight for king or country. You fought for the man in the next trench over, the one who lent you his blanket when yours froze stiff. And when he didn't make it, you folded his letter, packed his things, and tried
Not to think about it. Because grief had to be quiet too. And yet soldiers still found ways to make life absurdly normal. Someone might get promoted. Someone else might grow a mustache and insist it made him bulletproof. There were poker games in the mud, shaving contests, unofficial trench mascots, dogs, cats, even pigs. A Canadian unit kept a goat named Sergeant Bill, who once reportedly headbutted an officer. A true hero. And then there were the Christmas truces, those strange, fleeting nights when enemies became almost human again. The most famous one was in 1914, when men climbed out of their trenches, shook hands, sang carols, and even played football. It wasn't planned, it wasn't political, it was just exhaustion wearing a smile. Commanders hated it, of course. Nothing terrifies an army like men realizing they have more in common with the enemy than with their own generals. After that year, truces were forbidden, but small ones still happened, quietly, unofficially, between men who were just tired of pretending the war made sense. As the years dragged on, trench life became routine. A horrible, predictable routine, but routine nonetheless. New recruits came in, young, clean, optimistic, and veterans watched them with quiet pity. They knew what was coming. They didn't bother explaining. You can't teach despair. You have to live it. The old hands joked about everything, even death, because they'd made peace with the idea that life was temporary, but irony was eternal. And through it all, time kept passing. Days bled into nights, nights into seasons, seasons into years. You lost count. The world outside the trenches faded. When the war finally ended, abruptly, almost anticlimactically, many soldiers didn't believe it. Some didn't even cheer. They just
break bodies. It reshapes minds. Quietly, permanently, and sometimes beautifully. Unraveling of sanity.
It's November 11th, 1918, 11 a.m. The guns finally stop. For the first time in over 4 years, you can hear birds again. No whiz-bangs, no shouting, just a long, strange quiet that doesn't feel real. Some soldiers cried, some laughed, some just sat down in the mud and stared at nothing, because they'd forgotten what to do when the world wasn't exploding. They said the armistice was the war to end all wars, but if you listen closely, under the cheers and the bells, you could hear a collective exhale that sounded more like disbelief than victory. The soldiers went home, or tried to, and that's when the real strangeness began, because home had changed, and so had they. Imagine stepping off a train, the same one you left 4 years ago, and seeing your town exactly as you remembered it, but cleaner, quieter, smaller somehow. People smile at you like they expect you to be proud, but you're not sure proud is the right word. You've forgotten how to sleep in a bed. The sheets feel too soft, the silence too loud. You wake up at 3 a.m., sweating, because a door slammed somewhere down the street, and your body is sure it was artillery. You try to tell someone, but they tilt their head and say, "You're home now. It's over." And that's the problem. It isn't. For years after the war, veterans filled Europe's streets, limping, coughing, sometimes missing pieces of themselves. Some found work, some drank, some wandered. Many had what we'd now call PTSD, but at the time no one had the language for it. The doctors still called it shell shock, and people still thought it was something you could shake off if you just stopped being
dramatic. One British officer wrote, "I am home, but I do not live here anymore." And that sums it up perfectly.
Governments built monuments. Graves lined fields across France and Belgium, neat rows of white stones stretching to the horizon. The names carved on them, some known, most not. The unknown soldier became a symbol, a kind of quiet apology from the living to the dead. In London, Paris, Ottawa, Canberra, tombs were built for someone. A single coffin, standing in for thousands who vanished into mud. Each year they held ceremonies, trumpets, poppies, moments of silence that said, "We remember." And they did. But remembering didn't always mean understanding. Back home, the world moved on. Factories reopened, jazz started playing, skirts got shorter, hair got bobbed, and for a moment, it felt like life was trying really hard to forget itself. They called it the Roaring Twenties, but underneath all that glitter was a kind of exhaustion. A generation dancing because they'd seen what happens when the music stops. You could see it in the art. Picasso painted faces like they'd been shattered. T.S. Eliot wrote about a heap of broken images, and Freud, because of course Freud, decided everything was about trauma and your parents. The war had crawled into the subconscious of an entire century. And the soldiers? They found each other again. In pubs, in veterans' halls, in letters written at 2 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come. They formed groups like the British Legion, the American Legion, the Returned Soldiers League in Australia. They marched on Remembrance Day, medals glinting dull under gray skies. Not for glory, just for solidarity. They didn't talk much about the trenches themselves. When they did, it was with a strange fondness, not
For the war, but for the men they'd shared it with. You hear them say things like, "It wasn't all bad, you know. We had our laughs." That's not denial. That's survival. Because in a way, those muddy years had been the purest kind of existence. Stripped of everything except endurance, companionship, and absurd humor. Out here, in peace, everything was complicated again. A few wrote books, some painted, others stayed silent, and that silence became a kind of monument too. Robert Graves wrote Goodbye to All That, his memoir of trench life, and then promptly moved to Spain because England reminded him too much of ghosts. Siegfried Sassoon kept writing poetry, but also spent much of his life trying to reconcile the beauty of words with the horror they described. And Wilfred Owen, as we know, didn't make it home at all. Killed just 1 week before the armistice. His mother received the telegram on November 11th, while the church bells were ringing for peace. The universe, it seems, enjoys irony. Then there were the physical scars, the men who came back missing faces. This was the era before reconstructive surgery was really a thing. So surgeons improvised. There was a British sculptor, Anna Coleman Ladd, who made tin masks for disfigured soldiers, painted to match their skin, shaped to resemble their old features. It was equal parts art, kindness, and tragedy. Men wore them to walk down the street without frightening children. They'd smile, but the smile was literally made of metal. There's something heartbreakingly poetic about that. Beauty trying to heal horror. Even the land itself never fully recovered. The Western Front, once rolling countryside, was left cratered and poisoned. Fields where wheat had grown now sprouted rusted helmets and bones. Farmers plowed up shrapnel for decades, the so-called Iron Harvest. Even today, more than a century later, French farmers still find unexploded shells every spring. It's like the earth is still coughing up memories it can't digest. And the people who didn't fight, well, they carried their own kind of guilt. Women who'd worked in munitions factories went back to kitchens, or tried to, Those who'd lost husbands wore black for years. Mothers kept photos of sons who never came home, framed on mantels next to medals that felt like poor substitutes for a heartbeat. The collective grief was so vast that entire cultures changed. Funerals became quieter. Faith wavered. Even language shifted. All those euphemisms for death, like fallen, lost, gone west. The world had learned new ways to talk around pain. And yet, somehow, life kept going. New babies were born, the children of survivors, the so-called war babies. They grew up playing on fields that had once been battlefields, climbing over trenches filled with daisies. Maybe that's the only way the world heals, by letting time bury the shells and the memories together. But every November, the ghosts return. Ceremonies, poppies, the old poems read in quiet voices. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. It's ritual, yes, but also therapy on a global scale. When you listen closely to the memories, you start to realize something strange. The men who lived through it didn't really talk about war. They talked about waiting. Waiting for food. Waiting for mail. Waiting for it to end. Waiting to feel human again. The Great War wasn't one grand event. It was millions of small, slow sufferings stitched together. And maybe that's why it lingers. Because in some quiet, uncomfortable way,
Sat in silence, staring at the horizon, waiting for the guns to start again, because peace felt unnatural. Back home, people expected heroes, but what returned were ghosts, men who couldn't sleep without hearing shells, men who flinched at fireworks, men who couldn't explain why they missed the trenches, not the fear, but the simplicity. Because, strange as it sounds, the trenches gave life a brutal kind of clarity. You knew who you were. You knew what mattered. Out there, in peace, everything was complicated again. Men never talked about it. The poets did. A few memoirs surfaced, but most veterans just went quiet. They built lives, raised families, went to work, and carried the mud of France somewhere deep inside, invisible but permanent. Their children would ask, "What was it like?" And they'd say, "Cold, wet, long." And then they'd change the subject. Because how do you explain a world made entirely of waiting, noise, and silence? Let's float toward the end of this part. Imagine you're one of them, years later, older now, sitting by a window as rain falls. You remember the mud, the smell, the friends who never came back. You wonder if any of it made sense. It didn't really. But you remember a small flower that once grew by the trench wall, fragile, absurdly pink, blooming in the middle of chaos. And maybe that's enough meaning for one lifetime.
World will soon forget. The wars will come again. But for that moment, there's stillness. And maybe that's enough.
The funny thing about history is that it never actually ends. We draw neat lines, 1914 to 1918, the Great War, Armistice. But people don't live inside timelines. They live inside consequences. And the First World War left a lot of those lying around. It didn't just end lives. It rearranged the map of the world. Empires fell. Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, German. Whole dynasties collapsing like old furniture. Monarchs went from being divine rulers to unemployed cousins overnight. The old world, powdered, polite, and perfectly absurd, was gone. And in its place was something anxious, disillusioned, and very modern. The soldiers who came home became the backbone of this new era. Some went into politics, preaching peace. Others went into silence, unable to talk about anything. A few wrote, painting with words what cameras couldn't show. Mud that moved like quicksand. Sky that rained iron. Friendship that felt closer than blood. Those stories became textbooks, novels, films. But even the most vivid retelling could never quite recreate the smell, that sour mix of soil, smoke, and fear that clung to everything. That stayed buried in memory, like the unexploded shells still resting under the fields of Flanders. The war also changed how we remembered war. Before 1914, battles were about heroes and glory. After 1918, they were about ghosts. Memorials became quieter, no grand statues of men on horses, but instead endless names carved in stone. You could walk for hours past those names, each one once a person, now a whisper. The Meningate in Ypres, Belgium, lists 54,000 names of soldiers with no known grave. Every evening at 8 p.m., since 1928, buglers play The Last Post. No speeches, no applause, just the sound drifting into the night.
A century later, they still do it, because the silence never really left that place. Then there were the poets, our accidental historians. Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, Isaac Rosenberg, men who wrote about horror in verses so beautiful it almost felt wrong. They didn't describe battles, they described waiting, fear, mud, and loss. And by doing that, they made something universal. Today, when we read their lines, it's not just about the trenches. It's about any moment where humanity slips into madness and tries to pretend it's order. In that sense, their poetry isn't about the past, it's about the human condition. The war also changed medicine. Shell shock, once dismissed as cowardice, became the seed for modern psychology and trauma studies. Doctors like W.H.R. Rivers and Charles Myers began to realize that the mind could break from pressure alone, that invisible wounds were as real as the physical ones. It was the beginning of an idea we now call mental health, a quiet revolution born from horror. So yes, out of all that mud came therapy, understanding, and, eventually, compassion. Small mercies, grown from the worst soil imaginable. Culturally, the world was restless. You can see it in the art of the 1920s, jagged, fragmented, chaotic. The Cubists painted shattered faces. The Surrealists dreamt of melting clocks and headless men. The Dadaists made art that mocked the idea of meaning itself, because, honestly, how do you make sense of a world that just killed 20 million people? Even the music changed. Jazz broke all the old rules, syncopated, unpredictable, alive. It was rhythm as rebellion, a heartbeat refusing to fall in line. The young were done listening to old men with medals. But memory isn't just about what we preserve, it's also about what we try to forget. By the late 1930s, the world was already drifting back toward another war. New uniforms, new flags, same foolish confidence. The old soldiers watched quietly, probably thinking, "We've seen this movie before." Some of them had sons marching off to the next great catastrophe. It must have felt like watching your own reflection step into a mirror you couldn't break. And once again, the trenches filled. Only this time, they had tanks and airplanes, the future's version of the same old despair. After 1945, when the world finally paused again, people began to look back at the First World War differently. It wasn't just the war to end all wars anymore. It was the moment everything broke. Faith in empires, faith in progress, faith in the idea that humanity would always move upward. It didn't. It just moved sideways, limping a little. But maybe that's still progress, in its own awkward way. As decades passed, the soldiers faded away. The last trench veterans lived into the 1990s and early 2000s, quiet, wrinkled men sitting in front of microphones, their voices soft, their memories sharp in places and blurry in others. When asked about the war, they rarely spoke of bravery. They spoke of mud, of cold, of waiting, always the waiting. One old veteran said, "It was mostly boredom, broken by moments of terror. And mud, of course, endless mud." Another was asked if he was proud. He said, "I survived. That'll do." There's something deeply human in that. Not pride, not regret, just acceptance. And so the memory shifted again from first-hand stories to inherited ones. Now it lives in history books, in classroom posters, in old photographs with men squinting through grainy smiles. But also in movies, novels, songs. The myths of mud turned into modern bedtime stories. Maybe that's what remembrance really is. Not preserving facts, but feelings. The quiet ache of imagining someone else's exhaustion. Because once all the soldiers are gone, memory becomes imagination. And imagination, if handled gently, can keep them alive. If you visit the old battlefields today, they're strangely peaceful. The trenches are still there, grassy, softened by time. The cemeteries are immaculate, white stones in perfect rows, tended by gardeners who probably weren't even born when the last veteran died. Cows graze where soldiers once fell. Wildflowers grow where barbed wire rusted. The sky, of course, looks exactly the same. You can stand there and hear nothing. And that silence, after everything, feels heavier than any noise. The world moved on, as it always does. But the war changed the way we understand words like courage, sacrifice, and peace. Courage stopped meaning blind obedience. It started meaning survival. Showing up, enduring, helping the man beside you keep going for one more day. Peace stopped being abstract. It became something physical. A moment without gunfire. A sky without smoke. And the enemy? That became less of a face, more of a mirror. Because when both sides lived the same misery, fought the same mud, and wrote the same letters home, it was hard to keep pretending they were so different. So as we close this final part, let's slow down completely. Picture a trench, now just a line in a meadow. The war long gone, the air quiet, the earth still faintly scarred. You can almost see them there. Shadows of young men laughing at some forgotten joke, lighting cigarettes that never burn out. Their voices are faint, but they linger. They talk about home, about bread, about rain, about how much they miss sunlight. And then they fade, not gone, just resting. Because history, like them, never really dies. It just sleeps, waiting for someone curious enough to whisper its name again. So tonight, if you're lying there, in the dark,
drifting between thoughts. Maybe remember them, not as soldiers or heroes, but as people who once waited in the cold for morning to come. And somehow, even in all that mud and madness, they kept a little piece of humanity alive, which honestly is about as close to victory as anyone ever gets.
So, that's where we'll leave it tonight. In the quiet, somewhere between memory and forgetting. The soldiers are gone. The guns have long rusted. But the echoes, those small, tired human sounds, still drift through time like distant thunder that never quite fades away. If you listen closely, maybe you can still hear them. Boots in the mud, a low hum of someone trying to stay awake, a laugh that cuts through the cold for just a second. And maybe that's all history really is. Not grand battles or kings and treaties, but ordinary people doing their best to survive something extraordinary. So, wherever you are tonight, under soft light or in the dark hum of the world going still, thank you for being here, for listening, for remembering. Now, close your eyes. Let the past drift away. The trenches are quiet again, and you can rest. Good night.